What if a tiny kingdom on the far western edge of Europe, isolated by the Atlantic Ocean and overshadowed by larger neighbors, once commanded a network of territories that stretched across Africa, Asia, and the Americas? This is the saga of the Portuguese Empire, a story born from crusading zeal and daring exploration, carried on fragile caravels into uncharted waters and woven together by trade, faith, and ambition. Yet the same forces that lifted Portugal to unprecedented heights also sowed the seeds of decline. How could such a small nation create the first truly global empire, and why did it ultimately unravel in the face of rivals and changing times? Portugal's rise began not on the ocean, but on the battlefield. For centuries, Christian and Muslim powers struggled for control of the Iberian Peninsula in what became known as the Reconquista. This clash of cultures and armies stretched across generations, shaping the destiny of every kingdom in the region. Out of this crucible, Portugal emerged as a distant power with ambitions far beyond survival. The decisive moment came in 1139 when Afonso Henriques led his forces against Muslim armies at the Battle of Orique. Victorious and emboldened, he declared himself King of Portugal, an act that would mark the symbolic birth of the nation. Only a few decades later, the kingdom secured international recognition, and by 1179, papal authority confirmed its independence from Leon Castile, fixing Portugal firmly on the European map. Unlike neighboring Spain, which remained fractured into several large realms for much of the Middle Ages, Portugal consolidated early. This unity proved vital. With the central monarchy able to direct policy, resources could be coordinated more effectively, particularly in organizing armies and later naval expeditions. The geography of the land further influenced this direction. Portugal was a narrow strip pressed against the Atlantic Ocean, with limited space for agricultural expansion inland. Surrounded by mountains to the east and south, its natural frontier faced the sea. In effect, Portugal was oriented toward the water, its entire shape pushing it outward to the Atlantic. When opportunities for conquest within Iberia diminished, the ocean became its frontier. The legacy of the Reconquista left more than borders. It created a class of warrior nobles whose identity revolved around warfare, Catholic faith, and territorial conquest. Centuries of crusading battles forged a culture where victory brought both divine favor and earthly rewards. Such an outlook naturally extended overseas. The same men who once rode into battle against Muslim-held fortresses would later sponsor ships bound for Africa and Asia. Religion, too, became central. Catholicism shaped Portuguese identity at every level, defining kingship, laws, and national purpose. Conquest abroad was not seen only as economic gain, but as a mission to spread faith and Christian power into new territories. One remarkable feature of Portugal's early history is the stability of its boundaries. Established by the 12th century, those same frontiers remain in place today, making Portugal the oldest nation in Europe with unchanged borders. This continuity gave its people a sense of cohesion and permanence. Over time, that stability allowed the kingdom to concentrate on growing outward rather than defending shifting frontiers, a luxury few other medieval states could claim. By the late Middle Ages, Portugal's foundation had been set: a unified territory, a warrior nobility, and a deeply Catholic identity. These elements combined into an appetite for expansion that would soon be driven by the relentless pursuit of gold, the spread of religion, and the quest for lasting glory. From this starting point, an empire would rise. Prince Henry of Portugal, remembered as Henry the Navigator, never actually embarked on long voyages himself, yet he became the architect of a new age of discovery. Born in 1394 as the son of King John I, he belonged to a generation shaped by the military campaigns of the Reconquista. After playing a part in Portugal's capture of Ceuta in North Africa in 1415, his interests shifted toward the sea. He understood that Portugal's future power would not come only from battles on the peninsula, but also from controlling access to distant trade routes and resources. This vision set him apart from most of his contemporaries. From his base at Sagres in Portugal's southern Algarve, Henry brought together men skilled in disciplines few monarchs then considered vital for expansion. Cartographers, astronomers, shipbuilders, and pilots were summoned to work in one place. The aim was to improve knowledge of winds, currents, and coastlines. Although there was no formal academy, this community looked like the first organized center for maritime research in Europe. It combined theoretical study with practical training at sea, and every successful voyage contributed new details to maps that were quickly becoming more accurate. The voyages Henry sponsored focused largely on the Atlantic islands and the West African coast. Portuguese crews rediscovered Madeira in 1419 and reached the Azores in 1427. These islands served as stepping stones and testing grounds, allowing sailors to practice long-distance navigation away from the mainland. More daring expeditions targeted the coast of Africa. The objective was threefold: to link with the fabled Christian kingdom of Prester John, to gain direct access to gold flowing across the Sahara, and to undermine the position of Islamic states that had long controlled Mediterranean trade. Each of these aims reflected the combination of religious, economic, and strategic motives that had been forged in the Reconquista. The technical side of exploration advanced rapidly under Henry's influence. Portuguese shipbuilders refined the design of the caravel, a vessel smaller than the cumbersome Mediterranean galleys but with triangular lateen sails that could track against the wind. This design made it possible to venture farther into the Atlantic than ever before and to return safely. In 1434, Gil Eanes, sailing under Henry's patronage, rounded Cape Bojador. For generations, Europeans feared this point, imagining that waters beyond were unnavigable or even deadly. The successful passage shattered those myths and opened the road south. To navigate more effectively, Portuguese sailors also began using instruments in ways few Europeans had attempted before. The astrolabe, once used mainly on land, became crucial aboard ships, enabling crews to measure their latitude by observing the position of the sun or stars. This was revolutionary for ocean travel, offering a primitive but effective system of positioning long before the compass alone could suffice. Henry died in 1460, but the system he established endured. By then, Portugal had planted the first seeds of overseas expansion. The momentum he generated allowed successors like Bartolomeu Diaz, who later rounded the Cape of Good Hope, and Vasco da Gama, who reached India, to achieve landmark voyages that fulfilled Henry's vision of stretching Portugal's reach far beyond Europe. In the early 15th century, Portuguese sailors began charting empty islands scattered across the Atlantic Ocean. Around 1419, they landed on Madeira, followed by the Azores in the 1430s and Cape Verde several decades later. These discoveries were not mere geographical milestones. Each island group became a tool for experimentation, offering a model for how Portugal would later govern colonies across multiple continents. Because none of these islands had their own populations, the Portuguese faced no pre-existing societies to negotiate or compete with. Instead, they were free to shape the land exactly as they chose, laying out plantations, ports, and governance systems that would later be copied in Brazil, Africa, and parts of Asia. Madeira became Portugal's first testing ground for sugar plantations and transatlantic labor systems, lessons later scaled up in Brazil. The Azores served a different purpose. Located in the middle of the Atlantic, far from any continental shore, these islands became vital waypoints. Ships returning from Africa, or later the Americas and Asia, made use of the islands to take on supplies, repair damage, or seek safe harbor after storms. Their location also suited navigational study. From these islands, sailors observed how wind patterns shifted deep in the Atlantic. Such knowledge led to the discovery of the volta do mar, or return by the sea. This method required sailing west or north, away from Europe at first, before catching reliable winds back east. To those schooled in traditional coastal sailing, the very idea seemed counterproductive, yet it drastically cut travel time and allowed for safer passages home. Cape Verde, first settled in the 1460s, introduced the Portuguese directly into tropical waters. Unlike Madeira or the Azores, this cluster of islands sat just off the West African coast. The geography made them an ideal place for anchoring trade networks between Africa, Europe, and later the Americas. Before long, Cape Verde became one of the earliest hubs for shipping enslaved people to plantations abroad. It also functioned as a staging ground for continued voyages farther south around Africa. The island's location and facilities ensured they remained a key node in Atlantic trade for centuries. By controlling Madeira, the Azores, and Cape Verde, Portugal secured mastery of open ocean sailing. These archipelagos were not simply isolated settlements, but laboratories for empire. Through them, Portugal forged the techniques of colonization, refined plantation agriculture, and mastered the logistics of long-distance trade. Together, they transformed a small Iberian kingdom into the first state with clear ambitions to project power across oceans. After establishing a foothold on Atlantic islands, Portuguese ships began tracing the outline of Africa with increasing confidence. By the mid-15th century, they were navigating well past familiar shores, reaching regions that connected directly to long-established networks of trade in gold, ivory, and spices. These goods were highly prized in Europe, driving expeditions further down the coast. Yet, as the Portuguese extended their reach, they recognized that there was another source of wealth awaiting them: the trade in human beings. What began as encounters with local rulers soon grew into a system that would tie Africa, Europe, and the Americas together in a brutal web. The earliest major base of Portuguese activity arose on the Gold Coast, where the Portuguese erected Elmina Castle in the 1470s. Initially designed as a fortified warehouse to secure the flow of gold from inland rulers, the structure quickly became part of a broader network of coastal strongholds. The Portuguese named these posts feitorias, or factories, centers where commerce and protection overlapped. Rather than conquering territory deep inland, the Crown used these fortified outposts to control maritime approaches and ensure that goods passed through their hands. This strategy reflected a practical approach. Ships could exert power from the sea without the need for vast armies garrisoned across unfamiliar territory. African leaders were not passive participants. Many saw opportunity in Portuguese trade and negotiated directly over terms. weapons, textiles, and metal goods from Europe served as bargaining tools, exchanged for gold, pepper, ivory, and eventually enslaved captives. The balance often tilted uneasily between diplomacy and coercion. While European firepower gave the Portuguese an advantage in specific encounters, durable control depended on local alliances. Without cooperation from influential rulers inland, the flow of goods to the coast would have been cut off. As Portuguese activity expanded, human lives became central to the system. Enslaved men, women, and children were bartered on a scale unprecedented for Europeans at the time. At first, many were transported to the Iberian Peninsula itself, working in domestic service or agriculture. Their numbers grew so rapidly that by the late 15th century, nearly 1 in 10 residents of Lisbon was of African origin. The city became one of the most diverse in Europe, though this diversity was inseparable from subjugation and loss of freedom. The coastal trade extended beyond captives. Pepper provided a cheaper substitute for Asian spices, ivory was fashioned into luxury objects, and African textiles fed new markets. Each commodity tied the region more tightly into a growing global economy. For Portugal, these ventures offered both a profitable outlet and a testing ground for the methods of empire. Combining fortified bases, seaborne force, and negotiated partnerships, they created a template for expansion that would be applied across continents. The African coastline was not a passing stage on the route to Asia. It became the foundation for centuries of Portuguese involvement, long before other European powers appeared on the horizon. In 1498, a Portuguese fleet under Vasco da Gama reached the coast of India after almost a year at sea. His ships had sailed past the Cape of Good Hope, crossed the Indian Ocean, and anchored at Calicut on the southwest coast. This moment marked the first time a European expedition had connected Europe to Asia entirely by ocean. The journey not only confirmed the possibilities of long-distance navigation, but also shattered the idea that Mediterranean states controlled permanent access to Eastern trade. The monopoly that Arab and Venetian merchants maintained over spices entering Europe suddenly faced a direct competitor from the Atlantic. Da Gama's voyage did not appear from nowhere. It was the product of nearly a century of Portuguese expeditions, edging down the coastline of Africa. Each earlier trip had added knowledge of winds, currents, and geography. By the time Da Gama departed, sailors possessed practical tools like updated maps, compasses, and the astrolabe that allowed them to measure latitude at sea. These advances meant voyages could be plotted with more certainty, though they remained incredibly risky. A single mistake in navigation could strand crews thousands of kilometers from any harbor. The crossing itself demonstrated how dependent the Portuguese were on cumulative experience gathered from decades of Atlantic exploration. When Da Gama arrived in Calicut, his fleet was met with curiosity by local leaders. Yet the gifts he brought, cloth, breads, and ordinary European goods, failed to impress the wealthy merchants of India, whose commerce relied on highly prized spices, precious stones, and fine textiles. Compared to the established networks of Asian trade, Portugal lacked commodities of equal value. This disparity highlighted Europe's weakness in commerce at the time. The Portuguese could carry ships across oceans, but they could not compete in terms of goods offered. For many rulers, these visitors seemed minor players rather than rising powers. The return journey was brutal. Scurvy broke out during the voyage back across the Indian Ocean, killing more than half the surviving crew. Even so, the expedition carried a small but valuable cargo of spices that brought profit in Lisbon. Despite the losses, the expedition proved that regular trade with Asia was possible outside the established Middle Eastern and Venetian routes. That fact alone transformed the calculus of global commerce. The Portuguese crown now possessed a new path to wealth, even if it came at extraordinary human cost. When Vasco da Gama later returned to India at the head of a heavily armed squadron, the nature of these expeditions shifted. Instead of relying on balanced trade, Portugal began enforcing its presence with naval power. Control of sea lanes became more valuable than goods alone. This was the start of a system that linked empire and armed fleets, projecting authority across distant waters. Da Gama's opening of the route to India thus marked more than a successful journey. It signaled the beginning of European sea-based empires, where dominance at sea determined access to wealth and influence. In 1510, the Portuguese seized Goa from the Bijapur Sultanate under the command of Afonso de Albuquerque. This marked the first time Portugal established not just a trading station, but a territorial colony in Asia. Unlike earlier forts strung along Africa's coastline, Goa was envisioned as a capital. From here, the Portuguese crown could control fleets, regulate commerce, and anchor military power across the Indian Ocean. Its location along India's west coast placed it squarely on shipping lanes that carried pepper, textiles, and other valuable products, linking Southeast Asia, the Middle East, and Europe. Albuquerque's strategy differed from that of inland empires. He concentrated on capturing coastal strongholds and securing them with stone fortifications, rather than attempting to conquer vast interior regions. His methods were often severe, but they created a durable presence where Portugal could project authority outward. In Goa, this meant harbors equipped to shelter fleets and storehouses designed to protect goods. Every passing vessel could be monitored, and this became the foundation of a maritime system that relied less on territorial conquest and more on control of traffic along sea routes. Central to this system was the cartas. This was a license imposed on every ship moving through the Indian Ocean, forcing merchants to pay tribute or face seizure of their cargo. By embedding Goa at the center of this arrangement, Portugal effectively constructed a toll network that extended far beyond India. Compliance with this system was ensured by naval patrols, while defiance often meant destruction at sea. Though heavily resented by regional traders, the policy allowed Portugal to squeeze significant value from commerce far longer than its own domestic economy. Religion played an equally important role in the new colony. Missionaries, many of them Jesuits, viewed Goa as a base from which Christianity could spread deep into Asia. The Catholic Church's authority increased, eventually leading to the establishment of the Goa Inquisition in 1560. This targeted Hindus, Muslims, Jews, and even Portuguese settlers accused of heresy, embedding the colony with a rigid religious identity alongside its military importance. Churches, monasteries, and schools multiplied, giving the territory the nickname Rome of the East. By the late 16th century, Goa possessed features few other Asian cities had under European influence. It developed printing presses, had libraries accessible to officials and settlers, and introduced European-style approaches to medicine. Its population mixed Portuguese settlers with Indian converts, enslaved Africans, and people of Eurasian heritage. This cultural combination produced architecture, cuisine, and customs that were neither fully European nor entirely Indian. Unlike isolated trading posts, Goa developed into a functioning society. For Portugal, Goa symbolized a decisive shift. The small kingdom was no longer only exploring new routes, but actively administering overseas territories, using the colony as a headquarters for operations stretching from East Africa across to Japan. Remarkably, the Portuguese remained in Goa for more than 450 years, a presence that outlasted Britain's rule in India by centuries. After the new route to India had been secured and Goa was established as a capital, the Portuguese crown shifted its focus toward controlling the flow of spices. The demand for pepper, cinnamon, cloves, and nutmeg in Europe far outstripped supply, making each of these commodities worth extraordinary sums. Rather than attempt to dominate vast stretches of land, the Portuguese strategy relied on the sea. Whoever controlled the routes controlled the profits, and with a small population and limited resources, Portugal concentrated on choke points where ships had no choice but to pass. This approach brought the empire quickly into conflict with long-standing trading powers. For centuries, Muslim merchants from Arabia, the Ottoman Empire, and India had managed the exchange of spices between Asian producers and European markets. By inserting themselves directly into these networks, the Portuguese disrupted established patterns of commerce. Skirmishes soon followed, and Portugal relied on heavy naval firepower to gain the upper hand. Their fleets, equipped with strong hulls and large cannon, would outmatch regional vessels that were rarely designed for artillery battles. The superiority of Portuguese ships allowed the empire to impose its authority on waters where it had no natural foothold. Commanders like Afonso de Albuquerque orchestrated a series of campaigns aimed at cutting key arteries of trade. In 1511, Portuguese forces stormed Malacca, a city that controlled access to spices moving from the Indonesian archipelago into the wider world. 4 years later, they captured Ormuz at the entrance to the Persian Gulf, securing the route between India and the Middle East. These places were not left lightly guarded. The Portuguese constructed extensive fortifications, turning conquered ports into stone strongholds, backed by fleets constantly at anchor. A vessel passing through these waters now faced both cannon fire from the sea and defenses from the shore. The system expanded outward until much of the Indian Ocean resembled a network of toll stations. The Cartas licensing model, first enforced from Goa, now extended across vast distances. Ships refusing to comply risked cannon fire, confiscation, or worse. These practices became known as gunboat diplomacy, enabled by Portugal's innovative use of ship-mounted artillery that turned small caravels into floating fortresses. As a result, maritime power became the foundation of Portugal's overseas empire. By redirecting trade around the Cape of Good Hope, Portugal disrupted centuries-old networks and redirected immense profits into its royal monopoly. Control of sea lanes, not territory alone, became the empire's true source of power. In the year 1500, as Pedro Álvares Cabral's fleet sailed westward across the Atlantic on its way to India, it struck land far from its intended course. Though Cabral's landing in Brazil was likely unplanned, Portugal quickly justified its claim using the Treaty of Tordesillas, which had placed this portion of South America within its sphere, despite the continent's true size being unknown at the time. The discovery would soon reshape the empire's priorities in ways no one could yet imagine. At first, Cabral and his men called the land Isla de Veracruz, meaning Island of the True Cross, though it was not an island at all. The name soon shifted to Santa Cruz and eventually became Brazil. That final name derived from the pau-Brazil tree, a hardwood that produced a red dye cherished by textile manufacturers in Europe. Merchants quickly realized that this resource alone could bring profits, and it was the lure of these trees that initially bound Portugal to its new claim. Despite the geographic magnitude of Brazil, Portuguese attention during the early 16th century remained fixed on Asia. The promise of spices, black pepper, cinnamon, and nutmeg, seemed far more valuable than vast forested lands across the Atlantic. Brazil therefore developed slowly, its earliest importance tied less to settlement and more to extraction. Portuguese sailors traded with indigenous peoples on the coast, exchanging European goods such as tools, cloth, and trinkets for logs of Brazil wood. These cooperative exchanges were significant, though they introduced dynamics that would soon turn destructive. The contact between Europeans and native societies spread diseases that devastated populations. Over time, the trade relationships gave way to forced labor, land seizures, and violent conflicts. Those who had once acted as allies in woodcutting expeditions increasingly faced displacement from their own lands. The arrival of a permanent Portuguese presence meant a slow erosion of indigenous autonomy, coupled with the restructuring of regional life around European demands. Cabral himself continued on to India with the rest of his fleet after formally claiming the territory, but the implications of his stop in Brazil far outweighed his immediate mission. By giving Portugal direct access to a continental landmass, the voyage transformed Portugal's global role. The Portuguese crown was no longer only a maritime power stringing fortified outposts along sea lanes. With Brazil, it owned colonies of immense scale, rich in resources and potential for agriculture. One consequence of this unplanned discovery is visible today. Brazil remains the only Portuguese-speaking nation in the Americas. Over 5 centuries later, it is the largest Lusophone country in the world, a direct result of Cabral's chance landfall. His detour, accidental as it may have been, stands as one of the most consequential events in world history. By the 1530s, Portugal began to transform parts of Brazil into a plantation economy, centered on sugar. The northeastern coast, especially areas around Pernambuco and Bahia, proved ideal for growing cane. Volcanic soil, heavy rainfall, and the warm climate combined to make harvests reliable and productive. Within a short time, sugar became the dominant export of the colony and an essential source of wealth for the Portuguese crown. Ships loaded with barrels of raw sugar sailed regularly to Lisbon, turning a faraway territory into the economic lifeline of the empire. Profits grew so quickly that Brazil soon eclipsed all other Portuguese colonies in terms of value. At first, the plantation system relied on the forced labor of indigenous Brazilians. Portuguese settlers attempted to compel local populations to work in cane fields or cut timber for shipment across the Atlantic. Many resisted, fled, or died from diseases introduced by Europeans. High mortality rates and the difficulty of keeping control pushed colonists to search elsewhere for a labor force. By the mid-16th century, they turned decisively toward the importation of Africans, marking the beginning of Portugal's central role in the Atlantic slave trade. Over the centuries, Brazil became the primary destination for enslaved Africans in the Americas, receiving nearly 40% of all transatlantic shipments. The sheer scale of forced migration reshaped the colony's demographics and left a deep cultural imprint still visible today. This influx reshaped Brazilian society. In Salvador, one of the colony's early capitals, Africans and their descendants formed the majority of the population by the 17th century. Their presence left permanent cultural imprints on religion, language, and music that remain part of Brazilian identity today. What began as demographic necessity for plantations fundamentally altered the country's social fabric. The conditions under which enslaved people lived and worked were severe. Sugar production demanded constant labor, planting, cutting cane, and grinding it in mills that operated day and night. Mortality rates remained extremely high, and plantation owners treated enslaved labor as replaceable. As deaths mounted, shipments from Africa increased, creating a cycle where human lives were consumed in the same way as raw materials. Efficiency and profit dictated every stage of production, turning agriculture into one of the harshest systems of exploitation in the early modern world. The wealth generated by sugar elevated Brazil to the centerpiece of the Portuguese imperial structure. While forts in Africa and outposts in Asia mattered strategically, none compared to the profits from cane. By the 17th century, sugar revenue made Portugal a key supplier to Europe and sustained its empire despite challenges from other powers. In this sense, Brazil was not just another colony. It became the jewel of the Portuguese Empire, its value measured in both wealth extracted and the immense human suffering that underpinned it. In 1494, Portugal and Spain agreed to one of the most ambitious arrangements ever attempted by two European kingdoms. Known as the Treaty of Tordesillas, it set out a single imaginary line running north to south, several hundred miles west of the Cape Verde Islands. Lands discovered east of this meridian would belong to Portugal, while those to the west would belong to Spain. The agreement was approved by the Pope, giving it a sense of divine legitimacy, though no other European powers were consulted. This treaty transformed global geography into a ledger waiting to be divided, an audacious attempt to partition lands neither side had yet seen in person. For Portugal, the treaty provided not only security for its ongoing voyages around Africa, but also potential rights to territory across the ocean. The line happened to include the eastern edge of South America, although nobody knew its extent. When Cabral's fleet sighted Brazil a few years later, Portugal could point to Tordesillas as justification for claiming it. What might have been contested territory was secured through a clause drawn before anyone understood its full implications. That error of measurement is the reason Brazil grew into Portugal's largest colony and remains the only Portuguese-speaking country in the Americas. The treaty reflected Portugal's growing confidence at the end of the 15th century. By then, the kingdom had charted the African coastline, settled Atlantic islands, and reached India by sea. Unlike Spain, which looked inward toward conquering vast inland empires in the Americas, Portugal built its strategy on trade routes, ocean passages, and choke points. Fortified ports at Goa, Elmina, Ormuz, and Malacca allowed a small European state to dominate the essential flows of gold, ivory, slaves, and especially spices. Instead of large armies conquering interiors, Portugal relied on fleets bristling with cannon and garrisons contained in stone walls. Brazil gave the Portuguese Empire an entirely different dimension. Unlike an outpost in Asia, the continental colony required settlers, plantations, and systems of administration. Sugar plantations grew to immense size, supported by enslaved labor, and fed directly into the triangular trade across the Atlantic. Combined with the tolls and profits extracted from routes across Africa and the Indian Ocean, Portugal found itself holding both a maritime empire and a territorial empire, an unusual blend that no other European power of the era could claim. Global ambition also carried a spiritual mission. The Portuguese crown saw itself not merely as an administrator of commerce, but as a defender and spreader of Catholicism. Voyages wrote religion into their charters, and missionaries traveled with sailors to preach in Africa, Asia, and Brazil. Conquest and conversion proceeded hand in hand, driven by a belief in expanding both kingdom and church together. By the early 16th century, this combination of naval force, trade monopolies, plantations, and faith commitments created an empire stretching from South America to India to East Asia, achieved with remarkable speed for such a small European state. By the early 1500s, Portuguese ambitions moved far beyond the Indian subcontinent. Their navigators and commanders began targeting the bustling markets of Southeast and East Asia, regions that had long been linked by trade in spices, textiles, and precious metals. In 1511, under the leadership of Afonso de Albuquerque, they struck at Malacca, a city that stood at the crossroads of the Indian and Pacific Oceans. Malacca was more than a city. It was the key to the strategic straits that bore its name, and whoever held it could determine the flow of trade between the Spice Islands and the wider world. By capturing Malacca, Portugal gained not just territory, but control over one of the most vital arteries of early modern commerce. The conquest allowed Portuguese ships to command the routes leading to the Moluccas, known in Europe as the Spice Islands, where nutmeg, mace, and cloves were cultivated. These spices were immensely valuable in Europe, not just for flavoring food, but also for their role as preservatives in medicine. Dominating Malacca meant Portugal could funnel these goods through its own hands, reaping enormous profits and cementing its reputation as a rising power in Asian waters. Yet the empire being built here did not resemble settlements in Brazil or Madeira. The strategy was narrow but effective. Seize fortified ports, dominate the maritime entrances, and extract wealth without the need to conquer land in depth. A few decades later, another milestone was reached. In 1557, after years of negotiation and in exchange for helping to suppress piracy, the Portuguese secured the right to establish themselves permanently in Macau. This marked the first long-term European foothold in China. Situated at the mouth of the Pearl River, Macau gave Portugal access to silk, porcelain, and tea, while also serving as a convenient hub between China, Japan, and Europe. The settlement occupied an unusual position, operating in a semi-legal state, technically Chinese territory but run by Portuguese merchants under local approval. This unusual arrangement made Macau a bridge between worlds, where Chinese goods could meet Japanese silver, and both could be funneled back toward Lisbon. Even before taking root in Macau, Portuguese sailors had accidentally reached Japan in 1543. Their arrival carried remarkable consequences. They brought with them firearms, which were quickly noticed by local warlords, or daimyo. Within a generation, Japanese armorers had reverse-engineered these weapons and begun producing them on a large scale, helping to reshape the battles fought during Japan's civil conflicts. Alongside weapons came religion. Jesuit missionaries, foremost among them Francis Xavier, preached Christianity with surprising early success. Tens of thousands of Japanese converted within decades, and for a short period, European influence in Japan seemed strong. Through Malacca, Macau, and Japan, Portugal extended its influence from the Indian Ocean into East Asia. Instead of vast territories, it controlled a string of ports and harbors, linked like nodes in a network that stretched from East Africa to the Pacific. This system, lightweight yet far-reaching, made Portugal the first empire to establish itself on 4 continents, laying the groundwork for a world that was increasingly tied together by global exchange. By the middle of the 16th century, Lisbon stood at the center of the world's first global empire. It had grown from a modest urban settlement into the wealthiest city in Europe. Ships arrived constantly, their holds packed with cloves from the Moluccas, pepper from India, gold from West Africa, ivory carved along the Congo coast, silk from China, and sugar produced on Brazilian plantations. Enslaved people also formed part of the constant traffic, their presence in Lisbon a daily reminder of the hidden labor that powered these imperial networks. The city's waterfront was crowded with activity, the quays becoming a living marketplace where the treasures of 4 continents converged on European shores. At the heart of this transformation was the Casa de India, a royal institution based in Lisbon that maintained control over every aspect of overseas trade. Rather than leave commerce free to independent merchants, the Portuguese crown oversaw routes, regulated cargo, and ensured profits flowed directly to royal coffers. In practice, this meant Lisbon's prosperity came not from individual initiatives, but from a tightly centralized system. Ships from Goa, Macau, and Bahia all reported back to this institution, unloading their valuable goods into warehouses before redistribution across Europe. Lisbon was not only a port, it was an early experiment in global economic management. The cosmopolitan nature of the city was obvious to anyone walking its streets. Merchants, sailors, and envoys from Africa, the Middle East, India, and Asia gathered in markets and taverns, bringing with them unfamiliar clothing, languages, and customs. Lisbon's population included large African communities, as well as Jews, Indians, Japanese, and Chinese, all blending with local residents into one of the most linguistically diverse cities of its era. By the 1550s, the city even displayed street signs in multiple languages, an accommodation to the variety of people navigating its neighborhoods. Such diversity was remarkable for Europe at this time, and Lisbon's layered identity made it both a trading center of empire and a cultural crossroads. Wealth also marked the physical appearance of the city. Profits from the spice trade funded construction projects, such as the Hieronymus Monastery, whose soaring cloisters and elaborate decoration were paid almost entirely with overseas earnings. Nobles built new palaces along the waterfront, churches gleamed with imported gold, and richly tiled facades became a signature of Portuguese urban life. These displays of grandeur competed for attention with the bustle of sailors and laborers unloading cargo, contrasting splendor with the toil that sustained it. The empire's success attracted painters, writers, and natural philosophers to Lisbon, making it an early center of the Renaissance beyond Italy. New discoveries filled books and maps, while imported knowledge in mathematics, navigation, and medicine circulated among scholars. Yet beneath these signs of progress lay the human cost: forced labor on plantations, monopolistic policies that crushed free trade, and a system of exploitation that drained resources from conquered lands. Lisbon at its height embodied both extraordinary wealth and profound strain, as Portugal's reach began to overextend the capacity of a nation still small in size. In 1580, a crisis of succession left Portugal without a direct heir to the throne. The crown instead passed to King Philip II of Spain, joining the two kingdoms under a single monarch. This arrangement, known as the Iberian Union, lasted for 60 years. While Portugal and Spain remained legally separate states, in practice, Portugal no longer directed its own foreign policy or military priorities. For a maritime power built on independence, the loss of autonomy carried immediate consequences. Portuguese merchants, who once maneuvered freely across seas from Brazil to Japan, now had their fortunes tied to Spanish interests. One of the most significant shifts came in the perception of Portugal's empire abroad. Since the crowns were united, Portugal's overseas possessions suddenly became legitimate targets for Spain's enemies. Rivals who might once have respected Portuguese neutrality no longer felt restrained. The Dutch Republic, locked in a long conflict with Spain, launched attacks on Portugal's Asian bases with relentless energy. They captured Malacca and fought for control of Ceylon, breaking into markets that had once been Portuguese monopolies. The English, too, began contesting Portugal's influence in the Indian Ocean and off the coast of Africa. In the Atlantic, privateers prowled for Portuguese ships laden with sugar or spice. Lisbon had once managed a network of strongly fortified ports, but with fewer resources than Spain and a smaller population, Portugal struggled to defend them. Under the Iberian Union, the vast combined empire was impressive on a map. The largest territorial reach of any empire to that point, but the distribution of benefits was unequal. Spain focused most of its strength on defending American colonies and fighting European wars, leaving Portugal's trade posts dangerously vulnerable. As a result, the Portuguese were outpaced by rivals who were better funded and more single-minded. Unrest spread inside Portugal as well. Merchants resented being cut off from their traditional markets when Spanish enemies closed ports to Portuguese goods. The nobility watched as decades of patient maritime dominance eroded in just a few years. Many ordinary people saw Spain as pulling Portugal into conflicts that offered little reward. The Union began to feel less like protection and more like a drain on national strength. Over time, this discontent fed into organized resistance. Underground networks and exiled nobles spoke of restoring independence. By 1640, taking advantage of Spain's preoccupation with other European wars, Portugal staged a successful uprising and placed a new dynasty on the throne. Independence was regained, but the cost of the 60-year union could not be undone. Territories in Asia and parts of Brazil were lost. The tight monopoly over spice routes was shattered, and Portugal no longer stood at the forefront of European maritime powers. What remained was still vast, but the trajectory of unchallenged expansion had ended, and the empire moved into a slow process of decline. The 17th century introduced a dramatic shift in global power as two rising maritime nations, the Dutch Republic and England, entered the contest for overseas wealth. Both had observed Portugal's early successes, but by this point, Portugal was weakened by decades under the Iberian Union. Spain's priorities had drawn resources away from Lisbon, leaving its overseas defenses thin and its merchants cut off from once secure markets. Into this opening stepped the Dutch and English, determined to seize the flow of spices, silver, and sugar that had fueled Portugal's prosperity. The Dutch East India Company, or VOC, became the chief instrument of this new rivalry. Formed in 1602, it was granted powers similar to a state, with authority to raise armies, coin money, and govern conquered territories. In a series of campaigns, the VOC began dismantling Portuguese influence in Asia. Malacca fell to them in 1641, erasing a cornerstone of Portugal's Eastern Empire. Later, in 1658, they pushed the Portuguese out of Ceylon, gaining control of one of the key cinnamon-producing regions. By securing much of the Spice Islands, the Dutch not only weakened Portugal, but built a monopoly that produced staggering profits. The VOC at its peak was valued higher than the largest corporations of the modern day, a sign of how lucrative the spice trade truly was. The English followed a similar approach with the formation of the East India Company. They established trading posts along India's coastline, building alliances with local powers and relying on financial strength to cement their position. English merchants and officials eventually overshadowed the Portuguese in the subcontinent, where Portugal had once been the sole European presence. While England's rise in Asia came later than the Dutch, its shipbuilding and naval support gave it long-term advantages. For Portugal, facing two strong competitors in the areas it had dominated for over a century proved overwhelming. Across the Atlantic, the Dutch also turned their attention to Brazil, Portugal's most profitable colony. In 1630, Dutch forces occupied large portions of the northeast, including the vital sugar-producing areas around Pernambuco. They created what came to be known as Dutch Brazil, a short-lived colony that persisted for nearly 25 years. Yet despite military success, they never fully subdued the settlers, enslaved Africans, and indigenous groups who fought back through a combination of resistance and guerrilla tactics. By 1654, the Dutch were expelled, but the experience revealed just how vulnerable Portugal's American possessions had become. Portuguese defenses abroad often depended as much on locals as on reinforcements from Europe. Settlers, enslaved Africans, and indigenous soldiers fought side by side to hold back Dutch and English incursions. Lisbon simply lacked the manpower and money to mount large-scale defenses across a worldwide network. Over time, the loss of Asian strongholds and the challenge in Brazil transformed Portugal's empire. No longer the unchallenged pioneer of global trade, it adjusted to a reduced role, maintaining Brazil, parts of Africa, Goa, Macau, and Timor, but as fragments of a once commanding empire. In the final decades of the 17th century, reports of rich mineral discoveries in the Brazilian interior began spreading along the coast and across the Atlantic. Prospectors and settlers who pushed beyond the sugar-producing regions of Bahia and Pernambuco uncovered gold veins in the rugged lands of Minas Gerais. At first, the finds were modest, but by the 1690s, the scale of discovery transformed Brazil overnight. These deposits triggered what became the first great gold rush of the Americas, funneling enormous attention and resources away from coastal estates and into the mountains of the interior. By the early 18th century, Brazil was producing more gold than any other region in the world. Vast shipments crossed the Atlantic under heavy guard, and Portugal suddenly found itself drawn back into the front line of European power politics. Gold from Brazil replaced the weakening spice trade as the backbone of the empire's wealth. Lisbon became a magnet for European bankers and merchants, eager to share in the influx of precious metal. To make sure the crown itself profited directly, Portuguese officials enforced the Quinto Real, a royal tax that claimed 1/5 of everything extracted. These revenues helped fund forts at home and abroad, paid for European wars, and financed new palaces and churches in Lisbon itself. The boom set off one of the largest waves of migration in Brazil's colonial history. Tens of thousands of Portuguese peasants, artisans, and adventurers crossed the Atlantic, swelling the colony's population. Enslaved Africans were brought in even greater numbers, forced to labor in mines, riverbeds, and infrastructure projects. Villages became towns, and towns became cities in a matter of years, with settlements like Ouro Preto rising from mining camps into urban centers of tens of thousands of people. Wealth from the surrounding hills turned the city into the richest in the Americas, while inequality between those who owned mines and those who worked them grew more visible than ever. Another consequence was a shift in Brazil's geography of power. Economic life moved inland, diminishing the role of traditional coastal hubs like Salvador. Royal officials attempted to follow, tightening taxation and regulation in the mining regions. This produced resentment among settlers, who often tried to smuggle gold out to avoid taxes or clashed with representatives of the crown. Disputes over who benefited most from the boom became a constant source of friction between colony and metropole. At the height of the rush, well over half of all European gold came from Brazil, and Lisbon once again ranked as among the wealthiest capitals in the world. Yet the basic labor system underpinning this prosperity remained brutal. Enslaved workers provided the backbone of the workforce, their survival rates grim and their conditions unrelenting. Still, alongside hardship, the 18th century witnessed cultural innovation in Brazil. Baroque churches rose with altars of gilded ornament, music and literature flourished, and artistic styles blended African, indigenous, and European influences. Beneath this surface, however, grew a sharper colonial identity. Prosperity created grand cities and shining altars, but it also deepened inequality and planted the seeds of unrest that would later challenge Portuguese authority. In the middle of the 18th century, Portugal found itself under the decisive influence of Sebastião José de Carvalho e Melo, known to history as the Marquis of Pombal. Appointed as chief minister by King José I, he became the figure who steered both the kingdom and its empire for more than 2 decades. Unlike many of his predecessors, Pombal embraced the growing wave of Enlightenment principles sweeping across Europe. His approach drew on reason, centralization, and modernization, seeking to transform Portugal into a state that could compete once again with rival powers. His tenure would tighten royal authority at home and abroad, often through measures that appeared enlightened in aspiration but authoritarian in practice. The turning point that gave him extraordinary power came in 1755, when Lisbon was struck by one of the most devastating earthquakes recorded in European history. Entire neighborhoods collapsed, followed by fires and a tsunami that killed tens of thousands. To many, such destruction seemed like divine punishment, but Pombal directed attention toward reconstruction and planning. Rather than rebuild within the old medieval structure, he ordered wider streets, standardized building designs with earthquake-resistant features, and regulations on rebuilding material. These steps represented one of Europe's earliest attempts at a coordinated disaster response, organized by the state rather than the church. Lisbon's reconstruction became a symbol of both resilience and rational planning under his leadership. Pombal's vision extended beyond the capital. He reorganized monopolistic trading companies that had fallen into inefficiency, restructured tax systems, and pushed hard against corruption. His goal was a more disciplined and predictable flow of revenue to maintain Portugal's place in the Atlantic world. In the colonies, his measures were equally bold. In Brazil, he took aim at the Jesuits, who had long played a central role in educating settlers and protecting indigenous communities. Accusing them of resisting royal authority and building too much local influence, he expelled them in 1759. The removal of Jesuits opened territory to direct royal control, though it often left indigenous populations more vulnerable to exploitation. At the same time, Pombal promoted economic diversification. He sought to reduce dependence on gold from Minas Gerais, which was beginning to decline, and sugar, which faced heavy competition. Efforts were made to expand cotton and tobacco production and to stimulate manufacturing both in Brazil and in Angola. These adjustments aimed at integrating colonial economies more closely into Lisbon's strategy while limiting the autonomy of local elites who had grown powerful through mining and plantation wealth. Pombal centralized decision-making in Lisbon, often clashing with colonial interests, but ensuring imperial revenues were more tightly monitored. One striking feature of his administration was the paradoxical stance toward knowledge. He established one of Europe's earliest censorship bureaus, banning over 1,300 books on grounds of morality or politics. Yet at the same time, he opened public schools and promoted secular universities, reflecting Enlightenment ideals of education, even as he curtailed freedom of thought. His critics saw repression, while his supporters saw modernization. Although controversial, his reforms revived Portugal's foundations after decades of weakness. They prepared the empire to withstand the turbulence of the late 18th century. When King José I's reign ended in 1777, Pombal was dismissed, but his system of centralized authority and modernization left a mark that endured long after his fall. In 1807, Napoleon's armies marched toward Portugal. The French emperor had demanded compliance with the continental system, a trade blockade aimed at weakening Britain by excluding it from European markets. Portugal, tied to Britain through a long-standing alliance, refused to join the embargo. This decision turned the country into a target, and it was clear that French occupation was imminent. Facing overwhelming military pressure, the Portuguese crown made a decision unlike any in European history. Instead of resisting in Lisbon, Prince Regent João and his court abandoned the capital and sailed for Brazil under the protection of the British fleet. The exodus was massive. More than 15,000 nobles, administrators, and household members boarded a fleet and crossed the Atlantic. When they arrived in Rio de Janeiro in early 1808, the city was suddenly transformed into the political heart of the empire. For the first and only time, a European monarchy ruled directly from one of its colonies. This reversal of hierarchy reordered centuries of assumptions about metropole and colony. Brazil, once a source of sugar, gold, and raw materials, now housed the machinery of empire. The royal presence immediately shaped Rio. Printing presses, long absent in colonial Brazil due to censorship, were set up within months. A royal library, an academy of sciences, and learned societies followed. Administrative offices relocated from Lisbon began running the empire from emerging urban palaces along Rio's main squares. Streets were widened, infrastructure improved, and the city took on functions usually reserved for European capitals. For Brazil's population, daily life shifted as the colony now played host to the crown, military officials, and an influx of new settlers who followed in the fleet's wake. By 1815, these changes culminated in the elevation of Brazil to a kingdom equal to Portugal and the Algarve. Together, they were declared the United Kingdom of Portugal, Brazil, and the Algarves. This status confirmed what had already become obvious. Brazil was not merely a satellite colony, but an essential pillar of the monarchy. Rio, not Lisbon, served as the seat of royal authority, and wealth began flowing in new patterns. It was during this period that Rio received heavier royal investment than Lisbon itself, a striking reality that underlined how thoroughly power had shifted across the Atlantic. Conditions inside Portugal were starkly different. While the court enjoyed relative stability overseas, the homeland endured French occupation, famine, and growing reliance on British troops for its defense. Political instability deepened, and resentment mounted at the absence of the monarchy. When João eventually returned to Lisbon in 1821, he left his son Pedro behind as regent in Brazil. This decision carried lasting significance, for it placed a representative of the crown in the colony, even as Brazilian elites pushed for greater autonomy. The movement toward independence that followed was rooted in these extraordinary years when Rio de Janeiro became the true capital of the Portuguese world. When King João VI returned to Portugal in 1821, he left behind his eldest son, Dom Pedro, to govern Brazil on his behalf. At that moment, Brazil was no longer just a colony in the traditional sense. The royal court's years in Rio had elevated the territory to kingdom status, and with that came expectations of continued autonomy. Yet in Lisbon, the Cortes sought to bring Brazil back under tighter metropolitan control. They argued that the colonial privileges granted during the Napoleonic upheavals needed to be stripped away, and demanded that Dom Pedro himself return to Europe, leaving only minor administrators to manage affairs overseas. Such decisions quickly inflamed tensions. In Brazil, elites who had benefited from new positions of influence resented the idea of reduced autonomy. Urban groups in Rio also viewed the directives as a reversal of progress made since 1808. The requirement that the regent return to Lisbon was seen as an insult to Brazil's growing importance, and demonstrations in support of Dom Pedro began to surface. Brazilian leaders soon pressured him to resist these calls, urging that he remain in Rio and safeguard local interests against metropolitan interference. The breaking point came on September 7, 1822. Near the banks of the Ipiranga River, Dom Pedro declared Brazil's independence, announcing separation from Portugal and rejecting the authority of the Cortes. Uniquely, the independence movement did not dismantle the monarchy. Instead, Dom Pedro assumed a new role as Emperor Pedro I of Brazil. This created the first empire in the Americas and marked a sharp contrast to the republican revolts that characterized much of Spanish America. The transition was also relatively calm compared to upheavals elsewhere. There were scattered clashes, but the revolt lacked the mass violence seen in neighboring colonies. The independence of Brazil therefore preserved much of the old social order. Plantation elites retained their landholdings, the monarchy endured, and many administrative structures simply transferred from colonial governance to imperial rule. Even the military framework remained largely intact, ensuring continuity for the elite classes at the top of Brazilian society. For enslaved people and indigenous communities, however, little immediate change came as the labor system continued with similar intensity. In Europe, Portugal faced economic exhaustion and limited military capacity. The country could not mount a large-scale effort to retake Brazil. Recognition of independence came in 1825 with the condition that Brazil pay a substantial financial indemnity. This settlement provided Portugal with some compensation, but in reality it underscored how little leverage Lisbon retained over its most valuable possession. What followed was a major shift in global geography. Brazil became the only monarchy in the Americas, ruled by a European-born prince turned emperor, a system that endured until 1889. For Portugal, the loss was catastrophic. Sugar, coffee, gold, and other exports were no longer part of metropolitan revenue streams. From this point forward, the empire contracted dramatically, its ambitions redirected to Africa and Asia, but under far tighter limits than before. After the loss of Brazil, Portugal directed its attention toward Africa, where its oldest colonies had remained under partial control for centuries. Angola and Mozambique, first contacted in the 15th century, suddenly took on a new meaning. Without Brazil's sugar and gold, these territories became crucial to the empire's survival, sources of both resources and symbolic status for a nation that continued to define itself as imperial despite its reduced scale. Angola, in particular, emerged as the central link in Portugal's role in the Atlantic economy, serving for generations as the largest point of departure for enslaved Africans to Brazil. Even after independence in South America cut that connection, the structures of forced labor shaped Angolan society for centuries. The 19th century gradually ended the official transatlantic slave trade, but Portuguese authority adapted. Angola provided commodities demanded by industrial Europe, including rubber, ivory, and especially coffee. Mozambique's exports took on a different form, with cotton and tea plantations growing under forced labor systems, while its coastal position allowed Lisbon to maintain influence in Indian Ocean trade networks. Portuguese power concentrated along harbors and forts, a continuation of its older strategy of controlling gateways rather than entire interiors. Until the late 19th century, practical authority rarely extended far beyond the coast. This changed with the scramble for Africa, when European governments formalized borders and demanded occupation over mapped territories. To defend its claims, Portugal initiated expeditions into inland regions, often met with resistance from local communities. Angola's highlands and Mozambique's Zambezi Valley saw repeated uprisings against Portuguese soldiers and settlers. Military campaigns followed, many of them prolonged and violent, as Lisbon tried to transform commercial footholds into controlled colonies. Out of this process, officials began to speak of a third Portuguese Empire, one no longer centered on Brazil but on African provinces. Rule over these territories followed a model Portugal called assimilation. In theory, Africans could earn Portuguese citizenship, but the requirements demanded adoption of the Portuguese language, Christianity, and ways of life, effectively abandoning local traditions. Most inhabitants were classified as indigenous subjects, denied full rights while remaining subject to taxes, forced labor obligations, and restrictive laws. The system maintained dominance less through investment and development than through bureaucracy, severity, and neglect. Despite claims of empire, Portugal consistently spent less on infrastructure and administration in Africa than any other European colonial power. Yet Africa mattered immensely to Portugal's identity. Lisbon declared Angola and Mozambique to be overseas provinces, legally extensions of the metropolitan state rather than separate colonies. This redefined empire in terms that blurred the difference between homeland and colony, justifying long-term claims even in the 20th century, when most other European empires collapsed. What took shape in Africa was Portugal's last imperial project, an empire sustained through coercion, continually contested by resistance movements, and destined to become the stage for the final and most violent chapter of Portuguese colonial history. In 1933, Antonio de Oliveira Salazar, an economist turned politician, put in place the Estado Novo, or New State. It was an authoritarian system inspired by fascist models elsewhere in Europe, and it would dominate Portuguese politics until 1974. Salazar believed strongly in strict control and centralized authority. He outlawed most forms of political opposition, banned independent unions, and gave the government sweeping powers of censorship. Newspapers, books, and broadcasts fell under heavy monitoring, and public dissent could lead to prison or exile. To enforce this grip, he created the secret police force known as the PIDE, which kept close watch not only inside Portugal but also across its colonies, repressing challenges to the regime's authority. A key element of Salazar's state was the reimagining of the empire itself. He rebranded Portugal's colonies, Angola, Mozambique, Guinea-Bissau, Cape Verde, São Tomé, and Timor as overseas provinces. The official narrative insisted that they were not colonies, but equal parts of a pluricontinental nation that spanned 4 continents. In schoolbooks, children were taught that Portugal was geographically larger than France or Germany, an argument based on the inclusion of these African possessions. This formed a central plank of nationalist propaganda, portraying Portugal as a nation that had preserved its unity across oceans, while other empires had collapsed or shrunk. World War II and the years that followed marked a turning point for colonial powers. Across Asia and Africa, nations won independence, often through protest movements or armed struggle. Portugal, however, stood among the exceptions. Salazar refused to view demands for independence as legitimate, dismissing them as foreign-inspired revolts. He insisted Portugal's global territories would not be relinquished, and he made clear that Lisbon would resist international pressure. Despite repeated criticism from groups such as the United Nations, the United States, and even the Vatican, Portugal positioned itself as one of the last European states holding fast to empire in an age of decolonization. Portugal's stagnant economy depended heavily on its colonies during these decades. Angola exported coffee, Mozambique supplied cotton and cashew nuts, and both provided cheap labor alongside raw materials. Their production underpinned not only trade, but also gave Salazar a way to claim relevance internationally. Yet this reliance carried high costs. In the 1960s, with independence movements spreading through Africa, Portugal committed itself to maintaining control through war. Military campaigns in Angola, Mozambique, and Guinea-Bissau consumed nearly half of the Portuguese national budget. What makes this staggering is that Portugal at the time ranked among the poorest countries in Western Europe, and the investment in colonial wars starved development at home. Salazar remained in power for decades, ruling with deliberate austerity and caution, while keeping Portugal politically frozen. In 1968, a stroke forced him into retirement, replaced by Marcelo Caetano, who maintained the same policies. But by then, cracks had begun to appear in the strict system, as war abroad and frustration at home continued to build. As much as Africa broke free from colonial rule in the 1960s, Portugal chose a different path. It refused to relinquish its African territories, framing them not as colonies at all, but as equal parts of a pluricontinental nation stretching between Europe, Africa, and Asia. This refusal set Portugal apart from nearly every other European power of the time and created one of the most violent decolonization struggles of the 20th century. Beginning in 1961, armed resistance flared in Angola, soon spreading to Guinea-Bissau in 1963 and Mozambique in 1964. Each conflict was led by organized movements that tied their struggle not only to national liberation, but also to the ideological battles of the Cold War. In Angola, the MPLA emerged as the most powerful of several rival groups. In Guinea-Bissau, the PAIGC built strong networks in rural areas, while Frelimo in Mozambique sought to take advantage of the colony's long exposed borders. These movements shared a Marxist outlook and quickly found allies abroad. Cuba contributed fighters and instructors, the Soviet Union provided modern weaponry, and sympathetic African nations gave sanctuary. What began as local insurgencies soon developed into coordinated campaigns, equipped with training schools, logistics bases, and even airstrips in the case of Guinea-Bissau. The rebels grew more capable each year, while Portugal struggled to modernize its overstretched army. The Estado Novo dictatorship responded with uncompromising force. Lisbon refused to negotiate with the liberation movements and deployed its limited troops in grueling campaigns across 3 continents, Europe itself, Africa, and small garrisons abroad. Soldiers often operated with outdated equipment, yet the regime attempted to balance this disadvantage through counterinsurgency tactics. Villages suspected of aiding rebels were relocated into fortified settlements. Napalm strikes were used against enemy positions, and thousands of Africans were imprisoned in detention camps. These methods achieved temporary control in some areas, but left lasting scars on local populations and only deepened hostility toward Portuguese rule. By the early 1970s, the wars had become a defining experience for an entire generation. More than 1/3 of Portuguese men under the age of 30 had served in combat in Africa, many through long conscription tours far from home. Families were disrupted, casualties mounted, and the economic burden grew heavier each year. Portugal spent enormous sums it could not afford, making it one of the poorest economies in Western Europe, even as it devoted nearly half its budget to fighting overseas wars. The strain eroded morale within the military itself, as officers and soldiers began questioning the purpose of a conflict that seemed impossible to win. Unlike Britain and France, which had managed to negotiate relatively peaceful exits, Portugal clung to empire at any cost. The result was 13 years of continuous war, making it the longest and most expensive decolonization struggle in modern European history. In the end, the pressure proved too great for the Estado Novo regime to withstand. The inability to end the fighting and the growing discontent within Portugal's own armed forces set the stage for the revolution that would sweep the dictatorship away. On April 25, 1974, a group of junior officers launched a military coup that would change the trajectory of Portugal forever. Known as the Armed Forces Movement, they were not seasoned generals, but younger men who had grown weary of endless deployments in Africa, censorship at home, and an economy that seemed permanently stuck in hardship. When their tanks rolled into Lisbon, resistance barely appeared. Instead of clashes, they were met with civilians who handed them flowers. The image of soldiers carrying rifles with carnations in their barrels gave the revolution its name and became the defining symbol of the day. The Estado Novo dictatorship had ruled for more than 4 decades, maintaining power through surveillance, propaganda, and repression. Yet the military, the very institution meant to defend it, had turned against it. Crowds quickly filled the streets of Lisbon, cheering the collapse of a regime that had appeared immovable only days earlier. Students, workers, and ordinary citizens joined the soldiers, demanding not only political freedoms, but also an immediate end to colonial wars that had already consumed 13 years. Unlike other coups in southern Europe during the 20th century, this one gained legitimacy not through violence, but through overwhelming popular support. The aftermath moved at an astonishing pace. Within months, a provincial government formed and placed decolonization at the top of its priorities. Independence soon followed for Guinea-Bissau, Angola, Mozambique, Cape Verde, and São Tomé and Príncipe. Each case was handled rapidly, as Portugal's new leaders saw no reason to continue a project that had proven both unaffordable and destructive. But withdrawing from Africa would not be simple. Almost 800,000 Portuguese settlers, known as retornados, fled back to Portugal in a short period. Many arrived with little more than what they could carry, creating one of Europe's largest refugee movements following the Second World War. The abrupt end of Portuguese control left fragile new states caught in the storm of Cold War politics. Angola became a battleground where the United States and South Africa supported one faction, while the Soviet Union and Cuba backed another. Mozambique slid into its own prolonged civil war, fueled by the same global rivalries. The quick departure of Portuguese administration created political vacuums, and competing movements armed with foreign support worked to fill them. For the new Portuguese government, though, continued fighting abroad was no longer an option. The striking detail is how little bloodshed accompanied the revolution itself. In total, only 4 people died on the day of the coup. That was the full cost of dismantling the oldest authoritarian system in Europe and ending centuries of formal empire. In less than 2 years, Portugal went from possessing one of the largest overseas realms on Earth to holding no significant colonies at all. What emerged instead was a small European nation beginning the uncertain transition into a democratic state, increasingly tied to its continental neighbors rather than its former empire overseas. When the Portuguese Empire unraveled during the 1970s, one exception remained thousands of kilometers away on the southern coast of China. This was Macau, a territory that Portugal had administered since the mid-16th century. In 1557, Portuguese merchants secured their presence there as a permanent base for trade between Europe and Asia. What began as a small foothold soon became the most enduring European settlement in East Asia, surviving for over 440 years. Unlike colonies carved out through conquest, Macau's early existence relied on negotiated agreements with Chinese officials, giving it a unique status that shaped its longevity. By the 20th century, Macau had become the last visible remnant of Portugal's once vast overseas realm. After the decolonization wave of the 1970s, Lisbon no longer ruled African territories or Brazil. Yet on the shores of the Pearl River Delta, Portuguese administration persisted, even as neighboring Hong Kong prepared for its eventual return to China. This raised questions about how long Portugal could realistically maintain authority over a small city that was geographically and culturally part of China. The answer came in 1987, when Portugal and China signed the Joint Declaration. The agreement stated that Macau would become a special administrative region of China under the principle of one country, two systems, meaning the territory would retain a high degree of autonomy while recognizing Chinese sovereignty. This arrangement set in motion a transition that spanned over a decade. Portugal formally ended its rule on December 20, 1999, during a carefully orchestrated ceremony attended by both Portuguese and Chinese leaders. The handover differed greatly from the upheavals that had defined Lisbon's withdrawals from Africa a generation earlier. No wars, no sudden evacuations, and no refugee crises accompanied Macau's transfer. Instead, the moment was defined by a blend of nostalgia for Portugal's centuries-long presence and recognition that the empire's final chapter had closed. Even after sovereignty returned to China, Macau retained a visible Portuguese legacy. Catholic churches remained in use, colonial-era facades dominated parts of the old town, and Portuguese cuisine blended with Chinese traditions in local kitchens. The Portuguese language, although spoken by a small minority, was preserved as one of Macau's official languages. Laws, street signs, and government documents continue to be bilingual, making the city one of the few places in Asia where Portuguese maintains everyday relevance. This cultural texture became a lasting imprint of nearly 5 centuries of colonial history. The handover carried a wider significance beyond Macau itself. With this final transfer, Portugal became the last European power to formally abandon its overseas holdings, decades after France, Britain, or the Netherlands had done the same. In symbolic terms, December 1999 did not just close the book on Portuguese imperial ambitions, it marked the end of the age of European overseas empires altogether. From Prince Henry's early plans on the windswept coast of Portugal to the return of Macau to China, the empire's reach had lasted almost 600 years, shaping continents far from Lisbon. The Portuguese Empire proves how a small nation driven by ambition can shape the world, from Atlantic islands to Africa, Asia, and Brazil. But that same ambition led to overreach and decline. It's a powerful reminder that even the mightiest empires aren't immune to collapse. Like this story? Hit subscribe and explore the rise and fall of empires across history.